Back here.
Did other immigrant groups impact architecture in our cities as much as the Latinos are, or is this something different?
That's a great question. And it's
Would you
something,
repeat it, please?
Oh, have other ethnic groups impacted?
Have other ethnic groups impacted architectural design in cities as much as Latinos? That's
Yeah.
the question.
I think those traditional architectural styles, and perhaps the architect could answer this better than I can, have been influenced by European countries, right? So we see Greek styles, we see Italian styles, but contemporary architecture, I would say that Latinos are really being set apart and really being privileged as a group that can really affect the ways in which we think about cities and the kinds of styles that architects can use to improve the look of cities or just market to a wide range of people. There have been architects that are trying to establish Black new urbanism, and I've spoken to Asian American urban planners that argue that there should be an Asian American new urbanism, right? So who knows? I mean, this could turn into some multicultural kind of movement in the future, but right now it's all about Latinos.
Peter?
I gotta get the architect in me. There's two kinds of buildings. Robert Venturi is coming up here. There's a duck, and then there's a decorated shed. Right? A duck is a building that looks like what it is. That's like the ice cream stand that's shaped like an ice cream cone. Right? The rest of architecture in the world is just a decorated shed. It's a box with appropriate graphics on the outside, you know, columns if you want to be Robert Adam and go federal, right? Like the Bostonians did in the 1800. You put the fan light and the white columns, and yeah, I'm being reductive here, but my point is that what's important is give me your first name.
Johanna.
Johanna's pointed out. What's important about new urbanism is density. That's what makes good cities. To me, it's less important what goes on the outside. If it wants to be barriographics, and if that's what sells density, then so be it. But density and opportunity are the two sort of keys, and if the architecture supplies those, then they get my vote. That help? I hope.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what the question is in here, but I'm relating your comments, Peter, about sort of how neighborhoods have changed and the discussions we've had in this course up to this point about sort of how different new wave immigrant groups have come and moved through different neighborhoods, and how that might relate to whether it's the new urbanism or quite what, where you've got different styles that are very distinctly related to ethnic groups, and sort of how those two sort of might change over time, and what we might be looking at, you know, will San Antonio change, and what might San Antonio look like 50 years from now?
We're in a much more complicated culture today than we were when the colonials ran the town of Boston. And so the kind of architecture that emerges in the United States is going to reflect this non-homogeneous kind of culture that we have today, and I think that's fine. The keys are to allow as many different kinds of architectures to evolve, and presumably the good ones get to stay. I don't think it's right to be prescriptive about this.
I wonder if I could ask the question. No.
I got the mic. I'm an economist, right? So I look at this not through the eyes of an architect or someone who looks at culture. And I think about what is the impact of immigrants on architecture. And I'm immediately drawn to two places. The Lower East Side of New York with its tenements. If you've never been through the Tenement Museum in New York, make sure you do it. It is a phenomenal experience. And the Triple Decker here in Boston. Both of which I think were related to the waves of immigrants that came through from, let's say, 1880 in New York to probably 1910, 1915 here in Boston. Is that right? I mean, is there a immigrant architecture?
So Barry mentioned two neighborhoods. I used to live on 709 East 6th Street between Avenues C and D. Right? So I know this neighborhood. And the other one, the triple deckers during Dorchester and Somerville, those are the two highest density urban neighborhoods in the world. Right? Most dwelling units per acre than anywhere else. You look at those green dots on those census maps, and I rest my case. Density rules. And those are the places where the rent is cheap and the opportunities are close by.
Question?
Yeah.
Over here? It's coming. Wait.
Jed Schwartz, Somerville. Ms. Lodono, I was wondering if you would care to speculate on why the Hispanic population seems to be growing faster than any other American group.
Well, I think that several lectures that the Open Classroom series has had throughout the semester have pointed to various factors, right? Larger families, a younger population, and then also immigration, right? I mean, immigration is really what feeds the growth of this population, I would say. Does that satisfy you?
No. No, I'm looking for, there seems to be a presence of hope, a lack of disillusionment with upward mobility, which seems to be present in the older immigrant groups. A disenchantment, the disenchantment with the American dream amongst people who have been here for longer, relative to the Hispanic group, which is the relatively more recent immigrant group. That's my opinion. I thought I was wondering whether you shared that or anything like that.
Whether there's more hope within the Latino population?
Yeah. In other words, there's more hope for their kids.
Well, I mean, I think it would. I mean, I think it varies, right? Like, I can't generalize and say that there's more hope within the Latino population.
One observation just to make, this is not about Somerville, but it's about East Boston. I did some pictures over there, and I learned that there's a fair amount of tension between old school, lower middle class Italian families who've been there for a long time and didn't get the resources to move out. Right? Successful Italians say you go to Revere or Malden, or you go head north, right? And the resentment was focused towards the newer Cambodian and Brazilian and Hispanic immigrants who came in, got the new businesses and were highly motivated, and a tremendous amount of friction between those two groups. And I would venture that you'd see that same phenomenon in dozens of other emergent kind of neighborhoods around the country. So it's not unique, And I think that it's part of the process, right? Anyway.
Introduce yourself too.
I'm Grace Shepherd, and I think you half answered what I was going to ask, because I'm wondering, is there anything to suggest that the Hispanic influx and expansion is going to be any different than the Irish, the Russian Jews, the Italians, whichever group it was? I mean, reading about that molasses story you mentioned, you hear just how much trouble and what terrible things we're saying about the Italian population, and each group has suffered and has had its experiences. Is there anything to suggest this is going to be any different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most scholars would say that the Latino population is different in the sense that it's a very racially diverse population, and so you have to factor in the opportunities that different racial groups have, right, in order to really compare the Latino population versus earlier immigrant populations.
Because they're browner.
They're diverse.
Because most of them are
Diverse.
browner. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one thing to pay attention to is how much, when an immigrant group settles in a neighborhood. I shot a wonderful restaurant in Framingham Center that was Brazilian, and great food. How much does that culture encourage their kids to become anglicized, right? How much do they want to assimilate? Or do they want to keep them with mother kind of culture? I think that's one sort of, the Irish story in Boston, I think, is one of successful assimilation. And it took 150 years. So it doesn't happen overnight. But one hopes it does, I think.
Couple more?
Hi, my name is Megan. I was wondering how you saw
Megan, can you put the mic really close?
Sorry.
That's good.
How do you see gentrification fitting in with all of this and affecting maybe some of these neighborhoods in the future or continued development in some of these neighborhoods?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that worries me the most about the ways in which Latino urbanists celebrate the barrio but ultimately refashion it with Spanish architecture is that they're celebrating a place, the barrio, that is often being completely threatened by forces of gentrification, right? So the question becomes, if the barrio is such a good place, what are we going to do to culturally sustain it, right? It's a question about cultural sustainability that comes up for me in terms of the barrio and gentrification.
Joanna mentioned the Truman Show. If you want to see a really good movie, watch that film. Get it on Netflix. Jim Carrey is living in an ideal new urbanist environment. It's all pristine white, and he's riding his bicycle to work. And all of a sudden, a Klieg light, a giant, Hollywood Klieg light falls out of the sky and lands on the pavement. And he kind of looks at it and goes, what is that? It turns out he's in a bubble that is run by Hollywood, and they're filming his life for a TV program. And that's at the core of the criticism of new urbanism, that it's this ideal place, and it's manufactured, and it doesn't come out of a real place in America. It's been sent down by the urbanist gods on high. And it is one of the most inspiring films. I mean, it's touching what happens to this guy. So I highly recommend it.
Right, he's living in this new urbanist development, which is supposed to be idyllic, right? But he really wants to get out and experience the real world, right? I mean, basically he wants to go out and go into the city, right? So it shows you the kind of tensions that lie in the new urbanist
It's
kind of
celebration,
rhetoric.
right? The town, celebration.
Celebration
Yeah.
of Disneyland,
Yeah.
Disney World.
I
John?
have a question.
John?
I read recently about this battle or debate between the new landscape urbanists versus new urbanists. And I was wondering if either or both of you could explain what that is and what's the difference and what's the big to-do there.
Can I take it?
Yeah,
Credit?
yeah,
So I had to do, I spent a bunch of time at Harvard, and you're gonna love this one. First, the good news, landscape urbanists now have demonstrated that parks aren't a thing apart, but that they belong in the city, they are part of the city. And so the design responses now are incorporating that. And I think that's fantastic. That the whole, it's a one big fabric, and that parks can get tucked into spaces half the size of this room and be successful, right? So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. Harvard had a show of landscape urbanism, and the label on the show was, let me get this right. Yeah, it was a bunch of pictures, and it said, typology of urban aerial morphologies. You know what that is? That's 5 bridges. And why they have to do this? Campbell wrote an article about archispeak, right? And it's this, it's as if they have to invent language that's formal, right, to cover up their, right? It was the bridges were fine, but it was just 5 of them, right? Drove me crazy.
I think I also read a similar article that basically differentiates the landscape urbanism from new urbanism by saying that new urbanism is trying to impose urban living on people, whereas landscape urbanists are trying to understand that some people just like the suburbs and they want to live in them and they want to use their car, but they also want more green landscape around them, right? And so that's kind of like the debate stirring up landscape urbanism.
One more quick one. So it's 1988, and Campbell and I get invited to one of these seminars on redesigning the land that's going to be where the central artery is removed, right? This is prior to the construction. And Campbell and I said, well, you could just build like buildings there. And they thought we were like commies. You don't like green space. You guys are bad. And it's like the green mafia. You can't. It's like saying apple pie is like bad for you. And the trouble with the Greenway is that there's no density. There's nothing there. There's nothing driving the uses on the spaces. You need protection from the weather, you need places to shop, you need a place to pee, you need all that stuff, and there's nothing there. So it'll happen, take 50 years, and then we'll be fine. So I like having the land, it's great.
Let me take another crack at a question. I want to tie together what you've heard tonight with what you're going to hear 2 weeks from tonight. Remember, we're going to have Dan Okrent here, who's going to be talking about Detroit. And what Dan did is he went back to his old employer, Time Magazine, and he got them to buy a house in Detroit and to take, I think, 5 or 6 young journalists and have them live in Detroit for a year and take a look at what's happened in Detroit over time and where it might go. And one of the big questions that Dan wants to raise is, and I think we'll hear this in 2 weeks, is what's the future of a city like Detroit? Or let me give you another city much closer to home. I spent several hours going through Holyoke, Massachusetts last week. Much of it boarded up. Detroit once had a population of about 1.8 million, huge city, thousands of square miles. Holyoke has lots of boarded up buildings downtown that are an eyesore that would make it, quite honestly, somewhat difficult to get the typical business leader to come in and decide this is where they want to build a new plant. So I want to ask both of you, given what you've told us tonight, and I know this is a difficult assignment, if you had a canvas like Detroit, much of it now boarded up, much of it with a house here, 3 burned out ones on the next block, empty acre here, or a Holyoke where you have a very large number of older buildings that are boarded up. What are the kinds of things you'd want to do from an architectural perspective, from a design perspective, to make this city more livable, to make this city more economically viable?
Trinity College, Hartford, they get my vote.
Yeah.
So I put my my money with the institutions like Northeastern, like Trinity. Trinity made a huge investment in the infrastructure of the town that surrounded East Hartford. And East Hartford was another, almost like Holyoke. I mean, it was in really bad shape. And I think that you have to have brave, resourceful schools to make some of those investments. The business guys come later. They're chickens. Right? They want to see. But the development that's happened on this campus towards Ruggles and going across has been fantastic.
Okay, let me phrase it a little bit different. Okay, let's say we get Trinity or Northeastern or Boston University or for Harvard University to invest in some area. Let's call it Alston Bright. What physically would you put there to make it different, to make it vibrant? What would you do architecturally that would make it rich, as opposed to those 2 buildings you showed us in your first slide?
I throw stones at Harvard. Alston's going to be wonderful. I mean, my buddy owns a house there, and he's happy as a clam. His rent is, he's waiting for his properties to go up, values to go up. It's going to take a while, but Harvard's going to do right by that community in a big way. And as the value of recessions is that you have time to take a breath and think about the next wave of how this stuff ought to be designed. And they're getting better and better. And there are a bunch of really new, young urbanists, call them what you want, but I think they understand how to put these communities together. And I'm very hopeful for places like that. The other thing is, I'm coming to hear Okren. He is a genius. So I highly recommend that one. That's going to be a great, a lot of Detroit is now organic farms. Cheap land.
So it's commonly said that architects have a God complex. They try to impose things on people, right? I'm not an architect, I have an art background, right? So I would say that if I were to go into cities and think of an idea of what to do with them, I would bring together the stakeholders of the city, the residents, the people who will actually be living in them, which is very similar to what new urbanists try to do, right? With charter kind of committee meetings, but really listen to them, which is something that new urbanists have been accused of not doing, right? Listen to them and see what they want and what the city should look like, and that's how I would start.
Okay, let me give you an alternative in a city, Johanna, you may know. Medellin, Colombia, right? Your home city, right?
Right.
There was a former mayor, Sergio Fajardo, who, by the way, has his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in mathematics, I believe, who has done revolutionary things with architecture in your city. Really quite amazing in a city with very poor barrios, right? Could you tell us a little bit about your city and how architecture has been used to renovate the city and renovate the people?
Sure. Well, Sergio Fajardo, he brought together architects to build in one of the poorest slums in Medellin, Colombia, which is widely known as the drug capital of the world, right? It was renowned for, it was known for Pablo Escobar, which was the kingpin of cocaine, right? And so you have these slums in Medellin, which is where many of the people who worked for Pablo Escobar live to this very day, and who claim that he is still alive and he will come and save them, right? And so you have all of these warring factions in these slums. You have kids who can't go outside of their homes because they're just terrified, right? And so the mayor, Sergio Fajardo, he decided that architecture, and good architecture, modernist architecture, would enliven this area, right? Would give these children something to be proud of. And that's what he did, right? You see Medellin is a valley in the Andes, and the slums are up on the mountain. And out of these slums, out of these shanty towns, all of a sudden you see this modernist library just projecting out of the mountain. It's kind of amazing to look at. I wish I had the slides to show you.
Well, actually, I did see the slideshow some years ago. What was amazing about it, and I think there are dozens of buildings now, right? Dozens of buildings. There are schools, there are libraries, there are museums, there's a new university. I think there are performance spaces. But what Sergio did, what the mayor did, was to say, I'm not going to put those where most cities put them. I mean, when we build a concert hall, a convention center, and a new major library, we generally put it downtown, right? And he said, no, we're not going to do that. And so, brand new, and these are absolutely gorgeous buildings, stunning buildings, were put in the poorest parts of the city, as opposed to where they might go otherwise. And the impression I had from the mayor and the presentation he gave at Tufts University 2 years ago is that it really had an amazing impact on the people, the communities. You had, groups that had been painting graffiti on everything, and now you had kids getting together and roaming the streets to make sure that no one does it, to protect the community. So architecture itself, at least in this one case, properly done, can be used to change the whole culture of a city, make it much safer. As Fajardo said, we now have a murder rate lower than that of Washington, D.C. That's saying something. But the fact of the matter is I watched, and I have no architectural background, but I watched this presentation by the mayor, and all of a sudden a light went off, and I realized how important architecture can be in changing not only the structure of a city, but its culture. And in this case, taking on a city which had a deep, violent streak in it, and has revolutionized it by its architecture.
It's proving that somebody cares. I think that's the message.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think we might have time for one more question. All the way back. Wait for the mic.
Kind of two-part question. Rather than redefine community.
Could you say who you are?
I'm sorry. My name is David Kelman. Hi, my name is David Kelman. I sell real estate in the area. I'm also a housing share for the Boston Society for Architects. Kind of two-part questions. Rather than redefining community by building new buildings, how about reusing some of the existing housing stock and updating? And also, JP has been gentrified. If you go towards Hyde Square, it's being gentrified, and a lot of the low and middle class Latino population are being forced out. What do you do with the community that's been gentrified, and what do you do? How do you place the housing for people that have been pushed out for economic reasons?
That's a lot to tackle. I'm gonna take the first part and put the 2 cents in for the recycling old buildings. The cheapest building is a recycled building. The greenest possible building is when you recycle them. A couple of books by a guy who I think is a genius in this department. His name is Stuart Brand. One book is called How Buildings Learn, and it's really worth a read if you care about efficient and adaptable architecture. And the other one is an Eco-Pragmatist's Manifesto. It came out last year, and he makes the argument in favor of cities and a fascinating description of the slums, the barrios, as kind of places to cook new middle-class people. They move through them. And I recommend those 2 books highly. The gentrification issue, I think you can argue forever. I think it cuts 2 ways, and I'm gonna maybe pass. Sorry.
I'll engage with the first part of your question, which was how, why people haven't looked at existing housing stock. In my research, you know, the Latinization of cities becomes celebratory, particularly because this Latino immigrant population is perceived to come into this existing housing stock and revitalize it, right? By actually buying it and then, you know, bringing renters in or just improving it in some fashion or another. The problem then comes in when they paint it bright purple, right? And it just elicits all kinds of controversies. But, so.
Well, I want to thank you all, and particularly thank Peter Vanderbarker and Johanna Daniel for joining us this evening for a wonderful conversation. Again, I want to remind you, no class next Wednesday. Go to Fort Lauderdale. But 2 weeks from tonight, 6 o'clock, we'll be taking a look at demographic change in Detroit. Hope to see you then. Good night.